when a group of racist bikers tried to intimidate a quiet black man in a small-town diner. They had no idea they were messing with a Navy SEAL veteran. What happened next left everyone stunned. Watch the full story and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cracked asphalt of an empty highway. The world felt quiet, save for the steady hum of a weathered Ford truck rolling along the road. Behind the wheel was Jackson, a man whose calm demeanor hid years of intense training and battle-hardened experience. The truck, battered but dependable, seemed like an extension of him, practical, understated, and resilient. Jackson's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his fingers calloused and strong. The old radio crackled faintly, broadcasting a soft country tune, though he wasn't really listening. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, scanning instinctively for signs of danger or the unexpected, a habit that had long since become second nature. On the passenger seat beside him lay a faded canvas jacket adorned with a small patch, bearing the unmistakable trident emblem of the Navy SEALs. The patch was subtle, unassuming, like Jackson himself, but it spoke volumes to those who recognized it. As he drove, Jackson's mind wandered, though not aimlessly. His thoughts danced between the present and the past, threading through memories of missions carried out in distant lands, moments of both triumph and loss. Yet, despite the weight of those recollections, his face remained calm, as if carved from stone. He wasn't running from his past, nor was he dwelling on it. He was simply moving forward. Ahead, a small diner materialized out of the dust and haze, its flickering neon sign reading Joe's Diner. The establishment seemed out of place, a relic of another time, clinging stubbornly to existence on the edge of nowhere. Jackson slowed the truck, pulling into the gravel lot. A few cars and motorcycles were scattered haphazardly around, their owners likely inside, enjoying the greasy comfort of cheap food. He turned off the engine, letting the silence settle before stepping out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and motor oil. Jackson's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the diner. The building itself was weathered but sturdy, its peeling paint and creaking door giving it a certain charm. As he reached for the handle, he hesitated for the briefest moment, glancing through the glass. Inside, a small group of patrons sat at tables and booths, their conversations blending into the background hum of the place. In the far corner, a cluster of leather-clad bikers lounged, their laughter loud and unrestrained. The bell above the door jingled as Jackson stepped inside, drawing a few curious glances. He ignored them, his gaze sweeping the room in one smooth motion before he chose a booth near the window. It was an old habit. Always sit where you can see the exits. The vinyl seat creaked softly as he sat, and the table's surface bore the scars of countless meals and conversations. A waitress approached, her notepad in hand. She was young, with tired eyes that spoke of long hours and low tips. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary, her gaze flickering toward the bikers as if she could feel their eyes on her. "Burger, fries, and black coffee," Jackson said evenly, his voice low and calm. He didn't look at her directly, letting her move on without the weight of unnecessary attention. As she walked away, he allowed himself to relax slightly, leaning back against the booth. The aroma of burnt coffee and fried food filled the air, a comforting mix despite its sharpness. He glanced out the window, watching the road stretch endlessly into the horizon. For a moment, it felt like peace. But peace never lasted long. The bikers' laughter grew louder, their voices cutting through the ambient noise like shards of glass. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard and a voice like gravel, leaned back in his chair, surveying the room with a smug grin. "Well, would you look at that?" he said loudly, his words aimed at no one and everyone. "Seems we got ourselves a tourist." Jackson didn't react. He reached for the glass of water the waitress had left on the table and took a slow sip. The man's grin faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, gesturing toward his friends as he continued. "Hey, buddy," he called, his tone mocking. "You deaf or just rude?" The waitress returned with Jackson's coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. Jackson offered her a faint smile and a quiet, "Thank you." She nodded quickly, retreating toward the counter without meeting his eyes. The tension in the room thickened, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone present. Conversations hushed, and even the clatter of utensils seemed to fade. Outside, the wind stirred, rustling the branches of nearby trees, but inside the diner, the air felt still, expectant. The stocky biker rose from his seat, his boots thudding against the floor as he approached Jackson's booth. His friends watched, their smirks growing wider, eager for the show. The man stopped just short of the table, his presence heavy and hostile. He placed one hand on the table, leaning in slightly. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with menace. Jackson didn't look up. Instead, he set his coffee down gently, the sound of porcelain against wood unnervingly loud in the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite. "Something I can help you with?" The biker blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected response. Then he straightened, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Yeah," he said, regaining his composure, "you're sitting where you don't belong. This here's our spot." Jackson's gaze finally lifted, meeting the man's eyes with a steady calmness that seemed to freeze him in place. "I'm just here for lunch," Jackson said evenly. "That's all." The biker's bravado wavered, but pride wouldn't let him back down. His hand slammed against the table, rattling the salt and pepper shakers. "I don't think you heard me, friend," he growled. Jackson's eyes narrowed, just enough to signal the faintest shift in his mood. His voice dropped lower, colder. "Back off." The room held its breath, every eye on the two men. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the highway, its sound fading into the distance. Inside, the diner felt like a pressure cooker, seconds away from boiling over. The biker's lips curled into a sneer, but there was something in Jackson's eyes, a stillness, an unshakable confidence that gave him pause. For a moment, he hesitated, caught between his ego and a growing sense of unease. But hesitation never lasted long. The low hum of conversation in the diner had all but disappeared, replaced by a silence thick enough to cut. The stocky biker, still leaning over Jackson's table, clenched his fist tightly. His bravado faltered momentarily, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. His friends, lounging in the corner booth, were watching intently, their smirks growing wider with every second. "Maybe he's shy," one of them quipped, loud enough to be heard across the room. The group erupted into a low, mocking laugh, and the man at the table straightened, feeding off the approval of his audience. Jackson remained seated, his body language unreadable. He didn't fidget, didn't shift. He simply sat, as calm as the surface of a still lake, his eyes fixed on the man standing over him. "Look, pal," the biker began again, his voice louder this time, more forceful. "This is a friendly place. We like to welcome strangers properly." His tone dripped with sarcasm. "So, why don't you show a little respect and move along? Or do we have to teach you some manners?" Jackson's response was a deliberate sip of his coffee, the gesture slow and calculated. The calmness in his demeanor was unsettling, and it only served to stoke the biker's frustration. "Hey!" the man barked, slamming his fist onto the table. The sound reverberated through the diner, making the waitress behind the counter flinch. "I'm talking to you!" Jackson set his cup down carefully, aligning it perfectly with the saucer. Then he lifted his gaze, meeting the biker's glare with an intensity that could stop a freight train. "I heard you," Jackson said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm just not interested." The man blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the response. His lips twisted into a sneer. "Not interested, huh?" He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of stale cigarettes and cheap beer. "Well, too bad, because I'm making it your problem." The waitress took an uncertain step forward, her hand hovering near the phone on the counter. "Sir," she began tentatively, "maybe it's best if—" "Stay out of this," the biker snapped, cutting her off with a glare. She froze, retreating a step as her eyes darted nervously between Jackson and the man towering over him. The group in the corner booth grew louder, their taunts echoing through the diner. "Show him, Jimmy," one of them called out. "Teach the tourists some manners." Jimmy, emboldened by the encouragement, grinned and reached out, grabbing the front of Jackson's shirt. "Let's take this outside, tough guy." Jackson's hand moved so quickly that it was over before anyone realized what had happened. He grabbed Jimmy's wrist in an iron grip, twisting it just enough to make the man flinch. Jimmy's bravado crumbled as he tried to pull away, but Jackson's hold was unyielding. "Don't," Jackson said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Jimmy yanked his arm free, stumbling back a step, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "You think you're tough, huh?" he snarled, flexing his hand. "We'll see how tough you are when it's 5-on-1. The room seemed to hold its breath. Behind the counter, the waitress edged closer to the phone, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. "Don't," Jimmy barked, his voice sharp. "Put the phone down." She froze, her eyes wide and fearful. Jackson, still seated, let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting to the other bikers who were now rising from their seats. Chairs scraped against the floor, boots thudded heavily as the group moved to surround his booth. Jimmy sneered, his confidence returning with the presence of his gang. "You've got two choices, pal," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You can walk out of here or we can drag you out." Jackson didn't flinch. He reached for his coffee, taking another measured sip before setting it back down. "I'll stay right here," he said evenly, as though the conversation were about the weather. Jimmy's grin widened, as if he'd already won. "Fine," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Then we'll do it here." The tension in the diner was suffocating. The cook peered nervously from the kitchen, spatula in hand, while the few other patrons remained frozen in their seats, unwilling spectators to the brewing storm. The bikers moved closer, forming a semicircle around Jackson's booth. Their shadows loomed over him, their expressions a mix of arrogance and anticipation. They thought they had him cornered, their numbers tipping the odds in their favor. They were wrong. The first move came from a wiry man with greasy hair who lunged forward with a wild swing. Jackson moved faster than the eye could follow, sidestepping the attack and driving an elbow into the man's ribs. The biker crumpled, gasping for air as he hit the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Jimmy shouted, "Get him!" and the remaining bikers surged forward. One grabbed a chair, wielding it like a weapon, but Jackson ducked smoothly, grabbing the chair mid-swing and shoving it back into the man's chest. The biker staggered, tripping over his own feet as he fell backward into a booth. Another came at him from behind, but Jackson turned just in time, catching the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The biker yelped in pain as Jackson swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor. For a moment, everything froze. 3 bikers were already down, groaning and clutching their injuries. The remaining 2 exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken. "You don't want this," Jackson said calmly, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. "Walk away." But pride was a powerful thing. One of the bikers, a hulking man with a shaved head, charged at Jackson with a roar. Jackson stepped aside at the last moment, using the man's momentum against him. With a swift motion, he tripped the biker and pressed him face first onto the table, pinning him effortlessly. The final biker hesitated, his fist clenched but his resolve wavering. Jackson turned his gaze on him, his eyes cold and unyielding. The man froze, then turned on his heel and bolted for the door, the bell jingling faintly as he disappeared into the parking lot. The diner fell silent once more. Jackson straightened, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged. Around him, the bikers lay scattered, too stunned or winded to move. Jimmy, slumped over the edge of a booth, glared at Jackson with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "I told you to back off," Jackson said quietly. The room remained still, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. The fight was over, but the lesson was just beginning. The diner was still, save for the labored breathing of the bikers sprawled across the floor and the faint clink of a coffee cup as Jackson reached for his drink. He lifted it to his lips, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if the chaos that had just unfolded around him was of no greater consequence than a passing storm. The warm bitterness of the coffee grounded him, a small reminder that the world hadn't completely lost its order, even in moments like this. Jimmy, still slumped against a booth, groaned as he tried to push himself upright. His face was flushed with a mixture of pain and humiliation, a thin trickle of blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. He glared at Jackson, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you're tough?" he spat, his voice hoarse and trembling. "This ain't over." Jackson set his coffee down with a quiet clink, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent diner. He stood slowly, his presence commanding, and took a step toward Jimmy. The other patrons, still frozen in their seats, watched with wide eyes, their breaths held as if any sound might shatter the fragile equilibrium of the room. "You're done," Jackson said, his tone low and steady. There was no anger in his voice, no malice, only a quiet certainty that sent a shiver down Jimmy's spine. "Walk away while you still can." For a moment, Jimmy hesitated. His pride screamed at him to fight, to regain the respect of his crew and the onlookers. But the rational part of his brain, the part that recognized the danger in Jackson's calm demeanor, told him to back down. Pride won. Jimmy staggered to his feet, swaying slightly as he squared his shoulders. "No one tells me when I'm done," he snarled, lunging at Jackson with a wild swing. His fist cut through the air, but Jackson wasn't there. He sidestepped effortlessly, his movements precise and controlled, and caught Jimmy's arm mid-swing. With a single, fluid motion, Jackson twisted Jimmy's arm behind his back and guided him forward, slamming him chest first onto the table. The impact rattled the silverware and sent an abandoned plate clattering to the floor. Jimmy cried out, his voice muffled against the surface of the table. "Stay down," Jackson said softly, his grip unrelenting. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with stringy hair, struggled to his feet, his face a mask of desperation. He grabbed a chair and charged at Jackson, his movements clumsy but fueled by adrenaline. Jackson released Jimmy, stepping back just in time to avoid the swing. He grabbed the chair mid-arc, yanking it out of the man's hands and shoved it into his chest. The biker stumbled, tripping over a fallen salt shaker, and landed hard on his back. The remaining two bikers exchanged a glance, their confidence rapidly eroding. One of them, a burly man with a thick neck and a shaved head, clenched his fists and stepped forward, his expression a mix of anger and uncertainty. The other hesitated, glancing toward the door as if contemplating escape. "Don't," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The burly man froze, his muscles tensing as he weighed his options. Jackson's gaze was steady, unyielding, and it carried a weight that went beyond words. For a moment, the diner held its breath. Then, as if the spell had been broken, the burly man charged. Jackson met him head-on, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years honing his craft. He stepped into the man's momentum, using it against him, and delivered a sharp elbow strike to his ribcage. The biker grunted, the air forced from his lungs, and crumpled to the floor. The final biker, now visibly shaken, took a step back. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. When Jackson turned his attention to him, the man didn't wait for an invitation. He bolted for the door, his boots pounding against the linoleum. The bell above the door jingled as he disappeared into the parking lot. His retreat met with stunned silence. Jackson straightened, his breathing even, his expression unchanged. Around him the bikers lay defeated, their bravado shattered. Jimmy groaned from his position on the table, his face pressed against the surface, too humiliated to move. The cook peeked out from the kitchen, his spatula still in hand. The waitress stood behind the counter, her eyes wide with disbelief, her hand hovering near the phone she never got the chance to use. The other patrons exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and awe. Jackson took a step back, surveying the scene with a detached calm. "Anyone else?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Satisfied, Jackson returned to his booth. He adjusted the chair, smoothing the creases in the vinyl, and sat down. He picked up his coffee cup, now lukewarm, and took a sip. The taste was bitter, but he didn't seem to mind. The waitress hesitated, then approached cautiously. Her hands trembled as she set a fresh cup of coffee on the table. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson looked up at her and offered a faint smile. "I'm fine," he said. His tone was as calm as ever, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He nodded towards the plate on the floor. "Can I get a fresh burger, though?" She blinked, stunned by his nonchalance. Yeah, of course." As she hurried off, Jackson leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The world beyond the diner seemed untouched by the events inside, as if nothing had happened at all. But inside, the air was heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The bikers groaned and shuffled, too dazed to do more than nurse their bruises. The other patrons remained silent, their eyes fixed on Jackson, the man who had turned their quiet diner into a battlefield and emerged unscathed. Jackson didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He was here for one thing, and one thing only, a quiet meal, and now it seemed he might finally get it. The diner slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the air remained heavy with the aftermath of the chaos. The waitress moved cautiously behind the counter, her hands shaking as she brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The cook, still peering from the kitchen, eventually stepped back to his station, the clatter of his spatula echoing faintly through the space. Jackson sat in his booth, his demeanor unchanged, as though the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. His fingers curled around the fresh cup of coffee the waitress had placed before him. He took a slow sip, savoring the warmth that spread through him. Across the room, the bikers were beginning to stir. Jimmy, still slumped against the table, let out a low groan as he pushed himself upright. His face was a mess of bruises, his pride wounded far more deeply than his body. He glared at Jackson, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a simmering resentment. One of his crew, the wiry man who had charged at Jackson with a chair, staggered to his feet, clutching his side. He cast a nervous glance at his leader, then at Jackson, before muttering something under his breath and retreating to a corner booth. The others followed suit, each limping or clutching some part of their body as they regrouped, their earlier arrogance thoroughly beaten out of them. The waitress hesitated near the counter, her gaze flitting between the bikers and Jackson. Finally, she mustered the courage to approach him. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, Are you sure you're okay? I mean, after all that—" Jackson looked up at her, his eyes calm and steady. "I'm fine," he said simply, "just another day." She blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know," she stammered before retreating back behind the counter. The other patrons in the diner, a mix of locals and travelers, exchanged glances, their expressions a blend of awe and disbelief. One man, an older farmer with a weathered face and calloused hands, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that before." His companion nodded, his gaze fixed on Jackson. That guy, he didn't even break a sweat. Jackson, seemingly oblivious to the attention, continued eating his burger. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as if each bite was an act of defiance against the noise and chaos of the world around him. For him, the fight was over, and there was no need to dwell on it. Jimmy, however, couldn't let it go. He rose from his seat, swaying slightly as he steadied himself. His fists clenched at his sides and his jaw tightened as he stared at Jackson. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse but defiant. Jackson didn't look up. He finished his bite, chewed slowly, and took another sip of coffee before answering. "Just a guy having lunch," he said, his tone as calm as ever. Jimmy took a step forward, but one of his crew grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Let it go, man," the wiry biker muttered. "He's not worth it." Jimmy hesitated, his pride warring with the bruises that reminded him of what had just happened. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl and shrugged off his friend's grip. "This ain't over," he muttered, though even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. The group of bikers shuffled toward the door, their steps slow and heavy. As they passed Jackson's booth, none of them dared to meet his gaze. The bell above the door jingled as they left, and the silence that followed was deafening. The waitress let out a shaky breath and approached Jackson's table once more. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes filled with gratitude, for stepping in. They've been a problem around here for a while." Jackson glanced up at her, offering a faint smile. "It wasn't about them," he said. "I just wanted some peace." She nodded, though she didn't fully understand what he meant. "Well, if there's anything I can do to make your meal better, let me know." Jackson shook his head. "You've done enough. "Thank you." He finished his meal in silence, the tension in the diner gradually dissipating. The other patrons began to murmur among themselves, the spell broken as they returned to their conversations. The cook in the kitchen resumed his work, the sound of sizzling burgers filling the air once more. When Jackson finally rose from his seat, he placed a few bills on the table, neatly tucking them under the edge of his plate. The waitress watched him as he adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door, his boots echoing softly against the linoleum floor. "Wait," she called out, her voice breaking the quiet. He paused, his hand on the door handle, and turned to look at her. "Who are you really?" Jackson held her gaze for a moment, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just a guy who knows how to finish his lunch," he said before pushing the door open and stepping outside. The bell jingled softly behind him as he left. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and asphalt. Jackson walked to his truck, his movements unhurried. One of the bikers who had fled earlier stood near his motorcycle, his face pale as he watched Jackson approach. The man didn't say a word. He simply stepped aside, giving Jackson a wide berth as he climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, the sound breaking the stillness of the parking lot. Jackson glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of the diner and the people still watching him from inside. Then he shifted into gear and pulled onto the highway, the truck kicking up dust as it sped away. The road stretched out before him, endless and free, and the events of the past hour faded into the distance, becoming just another story in a long line of moments he preferred to leave behind. For the people in that diner, however, the story was far from over. It would be told and retold, growing with each telling until it became the stuff of legend. The quiet man who walked into a diner faced down a gang of bikers and left as calmly as he'd arrived. But for Jackson, it was simple. He wasn't a legend, he wasn't a hero, he was just a man trying to finish his lunch. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit subscribe for more engaging tales and captivating moments. Share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready for more, check out our other videos. There's plenty more to discover.